conversation about philanthropy and things about it. And our speaker today, Sterling Speirn, CEO of the Kellogg Foundation, has decided to use PowerPoints and song and dance. We have a whole lot of stuff. Guitar. We've got it going. But as we typically do, what we'll do for our purposes, and certainly Sterling's, is do a quick trip around the table and just introduce yourselves and where you come from and what brings you here, but very briefly. And then we'll turn it over to Sterling, and then we'll have lots of Q&A, and we'll go from there. It should be a lot of fun. So the young man on my left, would you mind introducing himself?
I'm Joel Freshman. I'm a teacher in public policy now at the Sanford School of Policy.
Jane?
I'm Jane Kendall, and I work with the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits.
She founded it.
I'm Rand Campbell with the North Carolina Center for Public Policy Research, and one of our founders is Joel.
No, he was the founder.
I'm Ariel Hayes, and I'm a first-year MPP student here.
Mary Now Kessel with Seasonal College.
Right about education in this community.
Adam Carter at UNC.
I'm Kristen Goss. I'm an assistant professor here and a former reporter at the Chronicle.
I'm Bonnie Hapgood with the North Carolina Network of Chronicles.
Alden Dunham, relic from the past, long since retired after 25 years at Carnegie Corporation, New York, and Carnegie Foundation for Investment Teaching.
Wow. Okay.
Chris Stang, Triangle Community Foundation.
Jess Saylor, Triangle Community Foundation.
Okay.
Henry Eisler, Research Scientist.
Okay, a little louder, folks, so we can hear it. George?
You're already keeping brave.
I'm Elizabeth Ireland, and I'm a first year in the Masters of Public Policy program.
I'm Bonnie Gordon, former program officer for the Illinois Education Foundation, and fellow of the ADC.
Barbara Jennelson. I'm assistant professor in program and education and also an office of community affairs.
Great, let's keep her on the back, and then we'll come back to the front.
Adam Jones Johnson will teach.
Right.
Barry Varela, Center for Society Center School.
Beth Anderson, I'm head of foundation relations at Teach for America, and actually took a course with Sterling from some business school at Stanford. You don't remember that, but it was the first course on philanthropy in the business school at Stanford.
Hi there.
My name is Dana Patel, and I'm a second year master of public policy student at the Stanford School.
Ginger Saul. I'm on the boards of CARE and WWN.
My name is Grace Kay. I'm a first year MPP student and a joint degree with the School of Business.
I'm Leslie Ware with the Zeus Reynolds Foundation.
I'm Martin Eakes with Self-Help and the Center for Responsible Lending. I knew Sterling when he was a young punk in Durham. He still had hair, and he was begging money from foundations. So I want to.
Some are in the room today, too.
Yes, we've missed a few. Please.
Tricia Lester, I'm vice president at the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits.
Right.
Francis Lester, director of the Duke Center for International Development.
I'm Rachel Ann Atkinson, and I'm a staff assistant in the elections office.
Sarah Burdick, I work with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy and Civil Society.
Great. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. Our guest is Sterling, CEO of the Kellogg Foundation, former CEO of the Peninsula Community Foundation in the West Coast, and as we go way, way back, public interest lawyer here in Durham when the tobacco factories were still doing their tobacco, but times have changed. Sterling has been at Kellogg for about 4 years now. And has made some decidedly important and impressive moves, and he's going to talk about that, plus other issues that impinge on him. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you all for coming today. Do I need this lavalier mic on, Sarah?
You have to have the mic on for the camera, not for the video.
Right, but
Yeah, you
I better do it then. I worry about video cameras in this day of YouTube because one likes to tell all kinds of stories in small collegial groups on college campuses. But very happy to be here today. It's a great honor. I've had the pleasure of working with Joel Fleischman and Ed Skloot in their various capacities in many philanthropic arenas over the last couple of decades. And as Ed and Martin both alluded, I took my first bar exam and was a young lawyer here in Durham 30 years ago. I said to Martin, I left and he stayed. And you can see who's been more successful in what he's done with his center. But in fact, it was here in Durham that I had my first encounter with a private foundation. I got my first grant, and it was that experience, and it was with, well, the two foundations we asked for grants at that time, Mary, were Z. Smith Reynolds and Mary Reynolds Babcock. Where else would one go sitting in Durham in 1978? But it was that experience that led me to, what?
Did you get your money?
From Mary Reynolds Babcock.
Mary was on the board there, too.
That's right. You may have been. When Bill Bondurant was there, we met with Tom Lambeth and Bill. But it was that experience that really led me to say, you know, when I moved to California, I'm not taking the bar exam. I am plunging into this nonprofit sector with both feet, and I've never looked back. So I may be able to share. And I would tell you that grant was a request for $11,000 to help tobacco farmers look at alternative cash crops to support their families. And what was just premature agronomy, I think, at the time. You know, so long as the tobacco subsidies existed, farmers had little incentive to walk away. But now, of course, that is all changed, and it was a great experience. Of course, as Beth alluded to, I have had the chance to teach my own class on strategic philanthropy some years ago at Stanford, but I thought I would take this seminar as an opportunity to focus strictly on my last 4 years at the Kellogg Foundation. I intend to get into the content and the work of the foundation, but this, in talking to Ed and Joel and reading Joel's book, which has been my textbook for this talk, because I think so many of the great issues that Joel pulls together in his book, The Foundation, are great guidance. And in fact, at my first board retreat in 2006, I gave every one of my board members and senior staffers a copy of The Foundation, because I was at the book signing at Cokie Roberts' house in Washington, D.C., and tried to give them the Cliff Notes as well. So in preparing to talk about a case study in how one foundation attempted to reposition or reinvent itself, I think Joel's book offers a wealth of insight into some good advice on what foundations must do, actually. So I am going to talk about that probably for the first part of my talk, and use the concept of organizational change in foundations to organize that. And then in the second part of the talk, and anticipating the different interests I hear in the room, I would be delighted to talk about some of our signature projects in food systems and in food work. That is, turns out, has been the longest and most persistent initiative of the foundation, about 30 years old. And as you can see, with the revolution in food in our country, it's truly bearing fruit. I can talk about our breakthrough work in a health project. I can talk about renewing democracy in the United States and our civic engagement work. I can talk about school reform and school change, all sort of based on some of the elements and criteria that Joel lays out in his book. Of course, now, the transformations of foundations, see if I can get my technology working. I'm only going to talk about the Kellogg Foundation today. But clearly, the transformation of a foundation is only meaningful if it results in transformation in the world. And I would argue, too, that the transformation of foundation relationships among themselves, with government, with the nonprofit sector, with grantees and other NGOs are also critical transformations. But I should say to you that the first question I was asked on coming to the Kellogg Foundation by insiders and outsiders alike was, what are you going to do to change the foundation? And my reply was, I didn't come here to change the foundation. I came here to change the world. And I meant that. I was moving from a small community foundation with $100 million in assets to a private foundation that had, at the time, $8 billion in assets. We, like most of our colleagues, have experienced about a 20 to 25% reduction in that, but $6 billion is still a lot of money to apply to changing the world. So that I meant that. And I also must say that I've been in organized philanthropy for over 20 years, and I've seen lots of CEO transitions and the classic mistakes or missteps new CEOs can make. present company accepted. I saw Hotting come into the Knight Foundation and do great work in terms of change and legacy. But I've seen many CEOs come into private foundations, and within 6 months or a year, half of what the foundation was doing is terminated. The other half has changed or shifted, perhaps with good reason and good results, but it struck me as an odd way to make change in long-lived organizations, which was like in geology, have this great discontinuity where what happened in that year? Well, we got a new CEO. And I think boards collude or collaborate in that because they want new thinking, they want to be challenged, and they often offer new CEOs a carte blanche. Look at everything. My board said the same thing. Tell us what you think. But if you believe in continuous improvement, new CEOs in corporate America don't throw out half of the product line and start all new products. Maybe in some cases, like the auto industry, they should have. But so I also had a feeling that the first thing I was going to do was ask myself instinctively the 3 questions I thought were important to ask about any foundation. Because I didn't know the Kellogg Foundation that well when I arrived. I knew certain small parts of it, that I'd had relationships with some of its programs. So, and also surprisingly, about 1 year into that process, I discovered a powerful model of organizational change, which ended up serendipitously being very useful to our process as well. And it came out of a training manual that we used for staff development at the Kellogg Foundation. But certainly change in foundations and the creation of critical strategies is crucial, but how you go about that change is also crucial. Let me just read a few quotes from the foundation to set the context here. This is from the preface, Joel's preface, of course, where he says, foundations operate at their highest level when they make their program choices within a structure of constraining boundaries and prolonged, disciplined focus. Then on page 60, he says, foundation leaders must choose the ends of their efforts for themselves and not by consultants and other advisors, as he writes about it. And then the final quote on the next page, their near absolute freedom makes it hard for most foundations to focus on specific goals. Instead, most foundation trustees end up specifying program areas that delimit the fields within which they plan to do their grant making. But choosing a field of grant making is not the same as being strategic. So I, following, although his book was not out yet, let's see if I can. There it is. 3 questions I asked myself. What did our founder intend us to be? What does the world need us to be, if that were the marketplace in which we were selling or providing products or utility into? And finally, what, frankly, or effectively can we be? That may remind some people of Jim Collins' sort of 3 questions in his getting to his hedgehog principle, but in fact, these are really foundation specific. So the first question was, what did Will Keith Kellogg, who created the foundation in 1930, intend us to be? This was a very important question for the foundation because we are often criticized for abandoning and betraying donor intent. In fact, I was insinuated in a Wall Street opinion piece by their taste editor recently. And so I think it's important for foundations at least to be honest whether they're following the founder's intent or not. Joel writes in his book that some founders give us no guidance and others tie our hands too tightly. But in fact, Will Keith Kellogg was a fabulous founder and a fabulous donor. So I go to the first question. Now, I got to the foundation, and my staff loved to superimpose these 2 pictures. Other than both being born on the 7th day, and Mr. Kellogg had a thing about numerology. He was the 7th son, the 7th son, and had a lot of 7s in his life. But other than this, and I should have put on a 3-piece suit, that was probably the only thing, both of us being from Michigan. But this is the picture of Will Keith Kellogg I like to hold up. Waldemar Nielsen, in both of his books on the big foundations and the Golden Donors, has wonderful chapters on Mr. Kellogg and the Kellogg Foundation. Surprisingly, he comes to the conclusion that he thinks Mr. Kellogg might have been, in the middle of the century, nearly as great as the greatest of the greats, Rockefeller and Carnegie, and of course Rosenwald. But Will Keith Kellogg, like many of these other philanthropists, started off, and as Nielsen writes, had not a very happy childhood. He dropped out of school in 5th grade. He was considered dim-witted because his eyesight was so bad. And in fact, he was not diagnosed for nearsightedness until he was 20 years old. He had a gloomy early adulthood, really wrote in his diaries that he didn't know if he'd ever amount to much. But in fact, by the time he was in his mid-40s, and he and his much more successful, larger-than-life big brother, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, accidentally discovered how to make flake cereal, he went on to reinvent himself as an amazing businessman, inventor, reinvented the field of advertising and marketing, and created a whole new product that exists to this day. So he was a child of his times. Because of that childhood, he felt very strongly about children. I have these two quotes from President Herbert Hoover and FDR. He created the foundation in 1930 and gave most of his personal wealth, $60 million in Kellogg stock, to the foundation in 1930. Just before that, earlier in his life, this long quote, but essentially he had a grandson who fell out of a second-story window. And he said, establishing the foundation was due in part that although I was able to pay for Kenneth's bills, I found it almost impossible to obtain adequate treatment for him during the first 10 or 12 years of his life. This caused me to wonder what difficulties were in the paths of needy parents who seek help for their children when catastrophe strikes, and I resolved to lend what I could, aid what I could for such children. This is a very important quote, and we've got 50 slides of quotes from Mr. Kellogg, but they all point to this. I want to help those with little or no income. I want to establish a foundation that will help handicapped children everywhere face the future with confidence, with health, and with a strong-rooted security in their trust of this country and its institutions. So whether you find talking about rural kids who are forgotten because they're in rural communities, whether they're physically handicapped, whether they're the children of needy parents, Mr. Kellogg's mandate was pretty clear of what kinds of people he wanted this foundation to help. And then finally, President Hoover asked him to come to the White House Conference on Children. It was the third one. There was one about every decade earlier in the 20th century, not so many recently. And I recently found another report on that conference, and I hate text PowerPoint, so don't read the last chapter here. Labor Secretary James Davis called for special federal efforts to help those he described as, quote, socially handicapped children. And notice these four categories: those in foster homes, the juvenile justice system, and black and Indian children. I was startled to see a reference around race and ethnicity in a quote from a labor secretary in 1930. And this also lent fuel to some of our strategic framework thinking going forward. But Mr. Kellogg came out of that conference and created the Kellogg Foundation, and this was the mandate he gave us. I don't want to restrict you in any way. Use my money as you please, so long as it promotes the health, happiness, and well-being of children. So as I read and scoured anything I could on Mr. Kellogg, it was clear of what our mandate was, the latitude we had, but who he wanted to benefit, that we now describe as vulnerable children, whether you call them at risk, underprivileged, disadvantaged, those were the kids. Well, I did not set out in my first year or two to say, let's rewrite our vision and mission statements. I find those exercises often futile and nothing but words on a page. But what came out of this discussion, when I kept asking what did our founder want us to be, it emerged, not in this order, a vision statement that actually talked about a nation that marshals its resources so that all children thrive. But this was part of another internal debate that had been going on for some time in the foundation, which was, does the foundation exist for all children or for some children? My combing of the literature made it clear that Mr. Kellogg was focused on those kids that faced special challenges. It wasn't all children, it was those kids, so that all children would thrive. So when I got to the foundation in 2006, our mission statement was helping people help themselves, which I thought was a wonderful value statement, and I hope and assume that most foundations pursue that as a strategy. But I don't think it told the world what we were created to do and what we were trying to do. So that, coming out of this discussion, led to the creation of this mission statement, which essentially says we want to work with people that want to create the conditions of success that will propel vulnerable children forward. There again, right, rewriting a mission statement is not a great accomplishment, but this actually came late in the process of this pursuit of the three questions. So we move on to the second question, which I think is really important because whatever the founder intended almost 80 years ago, how do you translate that into today's challenges? And I said, what is the world crying for? Well, if you look at the three systems perhaps most in crisis in our country, the education system, the health system, and our economic system, you might organize a foundation to pursue one or more of those areas. Now, Mr. Kellogg went on to write, 5 years after the foundation was created, that he was pleased with the work. He was a very hands-off donor, didn't attend many board meetings, never participated. He said, I'm glad that the educational approach has been emphasized. He said, relief, raiment, and shelter are necessary, but the greatest good for the greatest number can come only through the education of the child. And he goes on to say, the parent, the teacher, the family physician, the dentist, and the community in general. I found that an amazingly, I don't know that the word holistic was used much in 1935, but he had an amazing grasp of what it takes to educate a child. A Midwestern way to say it takes a village. And then he went on to say, education offers the greatest opportunity for really improving one generation over another. So that gave us some guidance in terms of which parts of these broken systems that our kids face might we focus on. So what came out of this conversation, and I can talk more about it later in our discussion, is a new strategic framework. I should say to you, when I came to the foundation, much as Joel describes in his book, we looked much like a university. We had various divisions and departments. They operated independently, and none of them explicitly talked about children or vulnerable youth. We had a program in health. We had a program in education. Actually, it was called Youth in Education. It was the only program that had the word youth in it. We had a program in food systems and rural development, unique for most large private foundations in the country, and a program in philanthropy and volunteerism, which was also somewhat unique for large private foundations. But none of those programs worked together. There was a small pot of fund that many foundations try to create for collaborative opportunities, but it was the smallest line item in the annual budget, and it was rarely used. And in fact, people told me when they tried to collaborate with other members in other divisions, it never really went very far, and one division or the other had to take over the running of the program. But you can see, looking at anticipating the question of what can we be, we had worked in health since the 1930s. We'd worked in education since the 1930s. We had addressed poverty and the issues of economic development only in our rural work, but defining vulnerable children as those who are poor and then face other risk issues, it seemed to me taking on these three areas would build on our legacy. We also lifted up the issue of racial equity and on civic engagement. So our involvement in philanthropy and volunteerism tended to be more of a private approach. Encourage private individuals to volunteer, encourage people to give, promote new ways of philanthropy. But we really didn't talk about how people participate in public problem solving. How do people engage in their communities outside of their private acts of service and their private acts of giving? Likewise, the more we examined the causes of vulnerability in the United States and elsewhere where we worked, we kept coming back to the issue of racial equity and historic racial disparities. And we said, if vulnerability rises for many kids of color out of the mere fact of their race or color, we can't talk about that as a side issue. We have to put it at our core. Finally, the last question, what can we be? Or what and where have we been? Of course, I asked, what things have we done in the last 80 years that would tell us what we're good at, where we've had successes? And just looking at our first 30 years or so, here was a short list of all the things we'd done in community health. The foundation helped create the community college movement. We'd worked in the allied health professions, nurse practitioners, all kinds of things, and we'd been a Midwestern foundation. That's sometimes to our detriment. We only get one mention in Joel's wonderful book because we were kind of a modest shirt-sleeves foundation in the Midwest, and our work was often kind of quiet and behind the scenes. We didn't feel we should talk about ourselves, and we didn't. But then people really didn't know what we stood for. So this is a copy of our budget the year before I arrived, showing you how our money was spread across a great array of programs and portfolios, and that small number the arrow points to was the cross-program and learning opportunities. It wasn't even a seven-figure number, and that was the challenge we faced. So to fast forward, we had always been a place-based funder. We are a national funder, but we don't fund everywhere in the United States. No one can. And we had been 10 years in the Mid-South Delta of Mississippi. We had exemplary programs operating in New Mexico across all our divisions. And of course, Mr. Kellogg had a great loyalty and allegiance to our home state. So I suggested to the staff and the board that at least for half of our work, we should focus on some states. So people identify with states, policies are determined by states. We track children's outcomes state by state. And you will notice from this map, Mississippi is always ranked 50th in most children's outcomes, and it hasn't moved much in the last several decades. New Mexico, surprisingly, is often ranked 49th or 48th, even though it is called the land of enchantment. These are small population states. They're very rural. There are only 2 million people in the state of New Mexico. There are barely 3 in Mississippi. But because we had been there with our programs, and it takes so long to get to know a place and a people, to Joel's point about persistence and long-term view, I did not start with a blank slate of the United States and say, let's pick 3 states where it'll be fun to work. There would be a lot more interesting states or places with more momentum, perhaps. But I don't want to diss these 3 states. In my own home state of Michigan, the economy has been in free fall, and its children's outcomes, with my hometown in the big city of Detroit having a high school dropout rate of 75% and an unemployment rate of 15%. With our major industry essentially vanished in my lifetime, the auto industry, and yet it was the home of Soapy Williams and George Romney and a great union and a great industrial economy. So it's a much bigger state. So, but for the other half of our work, we will work anywhere in the country where we find great opportunities. So this is now the strategic framework we're working with at the foundation. Those are the 3 elements and the 2 core approaches. And the weighting of those various lines is intentional. Because Mr. Kellogg said education offers the greatest opportunity, we expect over time to put almost half of our program dollars into education and learning. We've had a bedrock legacy in early childhood and have worked hard to unify the 0 to 5 world over the last decade. And then we're foolish enough to say we're now going to break down the wall between kindergarten and early childhood and try to look at an articulation from 0 to 8. But in the meantime, when we meet with big city superintendents who are thrilled to have us come and deliver more 5-year-olds ready to be successful in their school districts, they still tell us that they'll lose them in junior high if we don't help them stay the course all the way through high school graduation and on into college and college attainment, which definitely resonates with the new administration's goals for education. Still sensitive to Professor Fleischman, I'm not sure we have enough focus yet, and we may get to talk more about individual projects within this framework depending on your interests, because we still may be spread too thin. I'm not going to talk about our work in Southern Africa in 7 countries or our work all over the South America hemisphere ever since 1946. But the propensity for foundations to spread their money over many interesting projects and places is definitely an occupational hazard for achieving effect. So that is, I won't talk about our mission-driven investment. I'm gonna stop there. And can we talk? Do we get to talk, or do we? Because I now want to go to content and talk about food and health and some very exciting things we're doing that again respond to Joel's admonition to the examples he has in the book where foundations have actually taken on issues and stayed the course and achieve some sense of victory or put into place some institution or process or system that cannot be undone, is something I think all foundations should strive for. And so you have to pick your issues and your goals pretty carefully. And I think we're still in the process with this framework. I now think we have a framework with which we can argue about which initiatives and which projects should we take on. But even that said, I think we will still in the next few years keep winnowing down the focus. I also must tell you, I shared with Ed before starting today, Mr. Kellogg did not put in his trust documents that the foundation should exist in perpetuity. I know this is a very important issue to Professor Fleischman. He speculated in a letter that it maybe in 50 years the foundation would be out of business and that new philanthropists would pick up the baton and carry on. So we're one of those probably few large private foundations that has the option of spending down or spending more, which is a special privilege to have if, in fact, one found opportunities that were so appealing, one would not be restrained by a payout or a spending budget. The economic downturn is something else. That slide, you will note the profound similarities between 1930, when Mr. Kellogg started the foundation, just as the Depression is starting, and in 2009. Clearly the second worst economic recession we probably had in the last 100 years. And it's not clear where we're going to be going forward. All the more reason to focus our efforts on those things we think we can accomplish. So.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, no, I mean, I'm touched by what you had to say about the book and the usefulness of it. I'm struck by the fact that there was a lot about the Kellogg Foundation I didn't know. And had I known about them, I would certainly have included references because
that's why I came. There'll be another edition.
Edition 2, yeah. That's right. And you just missed the paperback edition, which came out last week. But there will be another one. I'll rectify the mistake. But seriously, I think that have you had time to put this new the budget through this new strategic framework going forward yet?
Well, the budget is now, rather than those divisions, the budget is organized around the 3 elements and the 2 approaches. And again, I had to be, when I said, Mr. Kellogg said education, we know that in taking a social determinants of health approach, all the issues that go into a person's well-being, and access to health care is only one of those, as critical as our national debate is right now, and we're a part of that. But the social determinants of health tell us that so many other things create the well-being of a person. And there's no question that educational achievement is one of the largest predictors of a person's health. So education is not just a cognitive thing. It is preparing a person for success and citizenship in life. So by some of my board members, it's fun when you look at just 0 to 8. If we could get every 3rd grader on grade level by 3rd grade, wouldn't some board members say, why don't we just put all our money into that? I mean, that's still, there's so much to do across. And when you think about it, when a child is 8 years old, they are just about, starting 4th grade, just about halfway to graduation. Now, within the 0 to high school graduation world, there's lots of debates. Oh, you're putting all that money into the little kids, and you're going to abandon a generation of adolescents and teenagers. And it really is not very fruitful to play off one age group or one area of expertise against another. It's clear that children need support, especially vulnerable kids. And they need it not just in their schools, and they need it in their communities and their families and across the entire safety net. So I'd love to talk more, if we get into school reform and school change, on using, again, as Joel writes, diagnosing and defining problems is critical to success. And I don't think the current efforts at school reform and school change embrace the complexity. We have a laundry list now of the great things foundations are doing. We're pursuing teacher quality as one issue in school change. It's clearly a big issue. But we have just announced a major initiative with the schools of education in the state of Michigan to transform the schools of education in a process to recruit new teachers and new talent to become math and science teachers in middle schools and high schools. But the goal isn't just to get more and better math and science teachers into our high schools and middle schools so that vulnerable kids will get algebra and learn science and become scientists, but it is to get better teachers in better schools of education that reach out to all the other schools on their campuses and support their new teachers when they go into urban schools where vulnerable kids are. Now that is a huge project. The Broad Foundation supported a wonderful project at Michigan State University, one of the, if not the best school of education in the country. Recruiters from all over the country come to Michigan State. It's a master's program to recruit students. The Broad Foundation supported a program where they recruited high school kids in Detroit who wanted to be teachers. And they said, you're going to have to work really hard because at Michigan State, the School of Education is the hardest graduate school to get into on this campus. The caveat was, of course, that to send them back to Detroit, we needed the teachers union and the school district to be willing to provide mentors and really support those teachers. And because that was not forthcoming from Detroit, those great kids and the great graduates of the Michigan State University School of Education go to Chicago. They go wherever they're recruited to go, into schools that want their talent. So teacher quality is a critical issue. We're going to put a lot of money into it, but teacher quality alone is like one of a dozen issues we must confront in school change. And I've got some models to talk about that. And yes, here's the expert in the room.
Well, on the question of setting priorities, maybe my view of Kellogg is tainted a little bit by having spent some time in South Africa, but I think of Kellogg, among your emphasis on child natural for an agricultural rooted foundation. How do you, and you said you've got to worry about setting priorities. So how do you think then about what you'll do internationally in light of what you just laid out?
Well, it's interesting. One thing, since 9/11, when I was working at the Community Foundation, 9/11 had a powerful stimulating effect at encouraging U.S. donors to give internationally, to look at the causes of international strife and say why was so little money leaving the United States into philanthropy. On the other hand, I had to take issue with people that in the simple math would say $1 in a developing country goes so much further than $1 in the United States. And I thought, well, and again, I would never argue with someone. I would, especially with my donors from Silicon Valley, you should give where you want to give and get good at it. I would never. But if we are successful in the developing country at getting people to where we are, God forbid they face the incarceration rates we face with kids who are, the cost of failure in our society is much greater than the cost of failure in a developing country. The cost of success is much cheaper in a developing country. So your question is, what your calculus be? Because when we are spending more money on state prisons and in state colleges, that's not a badge of honor to be a developed country. So I'm agnostic on that. But to your question, Ted, did you see the Sunday New York Times article on South Africa and the schools in South Africa? How teachers, even under a post-apartheid administration, do not feel accountable to their principals or their students and just don't come to work. And there's no way to get those teachers in South Africa to show up. The situation, I'm sad to say, is similar in Mexico, where we are concentrating on South American work, where teachers work 2 or 3 hours a day. So anybody that wants to berate our teachers' unions just has to look at this as not unique to the United States. It's a challenge, which is how we've organized our teaching force to be part of a commitment to children. And so we did bursaries when we first went to South Africa. We were one of the first foundations to go to South Africa, as you know, before the end of apartheid. And that was an interesting story of our relationship with the Kellogg Company, because the pressures to disinvest in South Africa and put economic pressure on the apartheid regime were strong. And the Kellogg Company was concerned because we had a large plant in South Africa. It was built the year I was born, in 1948. And so in a rare experience, the company execs and some foundation execs, and we're two separate entities entirely, went on a trip to talk to black South Africans to see what the effects would be if Kellogg shut its plant down. Our conclusion was we would eliminate one of the few places where there was upward job mobility for black South Africans. And so in that case, the foundation said, we'll go there. And the first thing we did was scholarships and bursaries for black African kids. I think, again, looking at educational achievement in Southern Africa and Mexico will be one of the things we'll look at as we emphasize that here in the United States. And the article on South Africa was very disturbing and troubling. Although I'm impressed with the new President Zuma on his first moves. His health minister has acknowledged the AIDS crisis, which is profound. To have the new administration say, we accept our fault, and we are going to do something about it. That's very exciting. That's very exciting. If we could do the same thing in education, that would be a big step forward.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I am focusing on that bottom left box, specific philanthropic engagement, which is what I study as a political scientist. If I'm reading this logic model correctly, you've got two ideas about how philanthropy can change the world. One is sort of a direct effect, giving to education, food, health, and economic security. And the second is giving to this sort of intermediary sector of civil society, right? And I think that's what that bottom box is about. And I'm just curious about how your strategies differ between the sort of direct approach and the indirect approach, and secondarily how the bottom box, or the civic and philanthropic engagement box, how you expect those organizations to affect those three outcomes that you're concerned about in a way that you couldn't do so directly.
I have a whole seminar on that.
Okay.
And let me start with a quote from Fleischman. Because this really was...
Get your dinner anyway.
I know. I know.
This
No.
is the margarine.
No, thank you. This is talking about civic engagement, or what I like to say philanthropy and democracy, frankly. Joel at page 12 had a fascinating commentary on the parts of a solution. He was talking about poverty. He said, neither the Earned Income Tax Credit, welfare to work, or the Child Health Investment Program represents anything close to a full-scale solution to our nation's poverty problem. Such a solution waits on government action, which in turn is dependent on the public will to act as expressed through the political process. When the people are ready to take the steps needed to eradicate poverty, including steps that will inconvenience the majority and cost money, then and only then will those steps be taken. I take your question, which is, I think philanthropy has a very special interest in the democratic process to solve public problems. And the fact that our democratic process is working so poorly and attracts so few people into public problem solving. Our model in philanthropy, Joel writes about it, is that we are society's R&D. Ilva-Sacker's passing gear. Although the metaphor of passing gear still begs the question as, who's in the car, where are we going? I had a nonprofit leader say to me, being a nonprofit is like trying to cross the country with a 1-gallon gas tank. And if you have multiple funders, it's with a carpool from hell. And the fact is, the model of R&D works in the corporate sector because the corporation invests in R&D and has a seamless process to take the successful findings in the laboratory to the market. We hit and miss build models, and I have said, I don't want to go to my grave having a garage full of brilliant models I have built as a philanthropoid, none of which went to scale or saw the light of day. So what's the process for society actually, what's the process for the ordinary person being hungry, for the R&D that flexible risk-taking philanthropy can do? So our field is preoccupied with what works. But I think the more important question is, who cares? Because, and Peter Block has a wonderful book entitled The Answer to How is Yes. So we can fuss about what works, and we need to find what works. But the question is, even when we find what works, like Early Head Start built on all the lessons learned at Head Start, and it was built by practitioners, and only 3% of the eligible children in this country get Early Head Start. So it's not a question of model building or what works, it's a question of, and now Nobel laureate Professor James Heckman was on Capitol Hill with us last Tuesday night talking to members of Congress about his economic analysis of early investments. But the American people aren't rushing to the ballot box to say, tax me for whatever it works because, but they also don't rush to the ballot box and say, stop funding those prisons. They pay for failure, but they don't pay for success. So what about the democratic process could foundations be involved in and stimulate to change that? And I think that is a key issue facing our country in its history of always reinventing its democracy to keep up with the changes in our society. It's fascinating to look at the democratic inventions that have been made at critical times. And I think with the economic downturn, some constitutional scholars say the Revolution, the Civil War, and the Depression were the 3 constitutional moments in this country. And here, what do we hear in California? We hear about perhaps we should have a constitutional convention because we Californians are unable to solve our problems. Now that scares everybody when you're going to but the fact is, rather than in that kind of dramatic way, I would like to say, what are the things that creative practitioners in the nonprofit sector are doing right now to get more ordinary people to struggle with hard choices when we'd like to think that most people's aspirations, I doubt I could find anybody on the street, maybe 1 out of 100, that wouldn't agree with our vision statement. We want all kids to thrive. We want kids to grow up with secure confidence in our country. But we're not doing it. So I'd love to talk with you more about that because what we're doing and exploring, and it might be a situation where we will be a driver because there aren't too many foundations funding civic engagement. It's a mushy term. But it still goes back to advocacy by interest groups or better information. And I fight with my friends in balanced journalism and media who still think that information is the way, you change public opinion. The formula says a person has raw opinion, you give them some information, and they come to very quality judgment. And that's not how people make up their minds. It's clear, but there are people like Daniel Yankelovich and others who've been looking at this issue for decades and seeing, there is a way to get a group of ordinary people in a room this size on a Saturday and have them talk about health care reform. And when I sat in a room in Tupelo, Mississippi last year with a group of ordinary people from Tupelo who'd been called on the phone, out of the phone book, they were demographically representative of the people of Tupelo by gender, by age, and by race. And in most cases, 80% agreement on almost every issue that they had the day to talk about. You wouldn't know that from the town hall meetings and where healthcare reform debate is going now. It's about fear and loss. But ordinary people in these dialogues in Kansas, Ohio, and Mississippi, and I saw a retired doctor who at the end of the day was surprised to have him in the group because you're not supposed to get experts, you're not supposed, but you do it demographically and you get an ordinary sample. And he, at the end of the day, said, I have been an advocate of the private sector and private solutions to these issues all my life, but now having looked at the issues facing us, I see that a public solution is necessary. That's not getting much traction right now in the debate. Even the public option falls off. But when ordinary people aren't doing it in a controversial way, but in a thoughtful, but in ways that forces them to make choices, it's amazing. And when you give them choices that span this, so those processes about deliberative dialogue and choice work need to be supported. And take a look at the community college movement. We didn't have community colleges 50 years ago. Imagine what it would be like if we didn't have community colleges. I think we need to invent new institutions in NGOs that do nothing but support public problem solving. League of Women Voters has tried to do it, and government is hungry for, I think most people get elected because they want to be public servants, and then they quickly discover that the public doesn't come to them with quality judgment. They come to them with special interests. And so I think elected officials are hungry for a public that has more horizontal conversations, as David Matthews would say at Kettering. But nobody supports that. And when I would go to donors in my board and say, how would you like to fund democracy or process or people talking to one another? They say that, where's your outcomes? Where's your impact? But I would say that if we don't find a way to reinvent our democratic process, and it's not just about getting people to the polls, it is definitely getting people to engage in public problem solving. And I think there's some great practitioners out there, but it's hard for them to. They get funded when there's a crisis, or they get funded to deal with one issue. I mean, you've seen deliberative dialogue on tax reform and on health care in Canada. It's been used in Eastern Europe around the issue of the Roma, the Gypsies. But it's always funded as a one-time only, and it's done with volunteers. And when the practitioners leave town, there's no infrastructure there to keep people coming back and saying, okay. And you could take public education. You could take any issue and say, we want you to talk about this as ordinary people, but we want to support you in this going forward. And those communities, I think, that discover ways to do this hard work, or those states, I think will leapfrog ahead, because they won't come to this sort of gridlock we come to whenever we're trying to make a hard choice. And I love that Joel said, solve poverty will be inconvenient to many people and it will cost money. But the choice of not solving poverty is 30% of our kids failing, and our country, it's not just about economic competitiveness, but we are definitely, we're sort of checking out on whether we want to be a quality developed country, or whether we want to just admit that we are a civilization in decline and we're all funders in a fallen world.
Before you take another question, let me just tease out one of your thoughts. Your concept to Kristen's question is the foundation should be very active in the world of civic engagement, should be encouraging positive actions on numbers of fronts, and yet over the last 2-3 decades at least, there have been small initiatives by many different foundations to pick up one thing or another, Ford, so on and so forth, organizing, advocacy, and so forth. And the CEOs, as you know, of the major foundations meet at least once a year, and they talk about what they're doing and what their agenda is. Bottom line is, the opportunity for the major foundations to get together and share amongst themselves and pick and choose one or two or three items, is there, has always been there. And yet the individuality and idiosyncrasies of the foundations have made it not happen. So if it's not going to happen among the thoughtful philanthropoids, who's it going to happen with? What is our role?
Well, again, Joel speaks to this when he says, don't depend on others for resources. If you're going to be bold and accomplish something that you want to make your signature project, be prepared to fund it yourself. And I think frankly, I agree with him when I go to my board and I want them to fund this initiative in Michigan to revolutionize our schools of education, and they say, what other funders are involved? I want to say this is our leadership. We're doing this. I mean, it's not a sign just because other funders involved, therefore it validates it. On the other hand, it's a reasonable question for a trustee to ask. On the other side of that, though, Ed, is we, and I think Cerna might have funded this too, we funded some major papers by the Monitor Institute and some futurists to look at our field about 10 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, called Looking Out for the Future and Cultivating Change in Philanthropy. And I am sad to say I don't know many foundations that have read that and paid attention to it. And this would argue a little bit counter to Joel's point, which is one of the unique opportunities of our field, and I shouldn't say it's against because Joel gives great examples of where foundations have collaborated, but our field, unlike the corporate sector, can exploit cooperative advantage. There is, my knowledge assets are free to the world. Other people will share with me what they've done, and yet there is this tendency to want to differentiate and have a brand. And our boards look to us to be the most innovative, the most creative, and to show what this foundation has done. And it's a challenge to be the servant leader to say, you know, I want it. Joe talks about being a driver, a partner, or a catalyst. I think you just need to be clear. In food, we've been a driver, but nobody would know it. We started working in agriculture in the 1960s, moved to integrated farm systems. My staff couldn't say sustainable agriculture. But before childhood obesity brought everybody to the table around food issues and healthy food, and before everybody, including my brother and sons, are become cooks and chefs, the Kellogg Foundation created a food and society program that brought together several hundred people every year to talk about food and society. And we had community organizers and farmers and environmentalists and the chief of staffs from big city mayors. And we now have this incredible group of Food and Society Fellows. One, Roger Doran, his project as a fellow was to get a garden in the White House. And of course, you can see he was successful. This is the strategy Joel talks about, building human capital. We have endowed 6 chairs in sustainable agriculture in land-grant universities, 2 most recently here in North Carolina, at NC State and NC AT&T. Building the intellectual, and they're entomologists, they're economists, they're all kinds of different disciplines, ethicists. Mott has funded one at Michigan State. Our staff said, we want to see what is now 2% of our food is grown in a sustainable way. We'd like to see that expand to 10%. How will we do that? We were working in farmers markets a long time ago. We've been looking at food deserts in poor communities. We've created the Farm to School Network. We're collaborating with lots of colleagues around revolutionizing school lunches. But it all came out of our work in food systems, not our work in health. So you can see by the framework, and I should say, Christine, I wouldn't call this a logic model. It's a nice diagram. It doesn't say how the world is going to change. It just says where our resources might flow. I'm just very cautious of using words that are powerful like logic models. But our food work no longer sits in a group that's food systems and rural development. I looked at our food work that had been evolving over 30 years, literally, and really created this movement that now you cannot turn around and find someone who's not. This group of Food and Society Fellows are just a fascinating group of farmers and chefs and activists and innkeepers and writers and filmmakers. Everybody's doing this, and yet changing how people eat and their levels of physical activity, I can't think of 2 harder things to do in the world. So our food work now is moving into a partner. We've been a driver, a quiet driver, but now everybody's jumping into food work, at least around healthy food or childhood obesity. We talk about food in children. Now we want to be a partner with Robert Wood Johnson. All of our health funders are coming into food, and a lot of individual donors are saying, this childhood obesity, what can I do? Well, we don't need people to reinvent community approaches on encouraging people to exercise more and eat better or eat less. We'll partner with Robert Wood Johnson and the food companies in a healthy weight management commitment that's going to go public in a few weeks, which is trying to help food companies also encourage people to get caloric balance. The evidence seems to be that people don't consume a lot more calories than they did a generation ago, but they sure do exercise less. And in the UK, the idea, their national approach to solving this is to tell people across the classes, which is the common enemy is modern life. None of us has enough time to exercise, and we eat, and we in our rush, we don't eat as well as we can. So I think it's going to be a fascinating case study to see whether foundations can be part of actually changing the way people eat and act. But the fact that at least in the food world, in the Farm Bill, in terms of changing law, in the Farm Bill we helped get $5 billion of new money funding food issues and not farm issues. In school lunches, state by state, once we changed school lunches, it was one thing to get sugar sodas out of lunches, but it turns out the alternative food sold in our schools now by Pizza Hut and by all the vendors, it's much cheaper for schools to hire an outside fast food company to come in and provide food for their kids. So you're up against budgets, you're up against economies, and then the founder of the South Beach Diet was profiled in a Sunday New York Times magazine about 3 years ago on his earnest efforts to work with the school to change the food in that school. And it was a case study, thanks to the Times reporter, on the adage which every problem worthy of attack proves its worth by attacking back. He had support from principals, everybody involved, and once he really went in and tried to make change, he discovered how hard it is, those oppositional interests that you discover even when they invite you in. So it's exciting work, and it's exciting on how it's being embraced across so many other. Our Food and Society Conference now is, I would encourage you to, if you can get in, is the most amazing gathering of eclectic people all working on food issues, from rural areas to big cities, and it's exciting. But I would say, had the Kellogg Foundation sort of not doing this work quietly for 2 or 3 decades, the field would be nowhere near it is now. But we haven't told that story. Also, because 2/3 of our assets are owned our Kellogg company stock, sometimes people suspect our motives because of our financial relationship to the Kellogg company. But the fact is, we got into food and food systems work out of our work in agriculture, not out of any relationship to the Kellogg company.
I wanted to come back to the question about renewing democracy, which I think is really a great theme. I want to affirm the problem, but hear more of your thought on solutions. The longer I've been in this, the more I'm starting to think that even when nonprofits successfully provide an R&D model, it almost doesn't matter if in the debate, so my recent experience over the last 8 or 10 years is that anything that is worth doing has tremendous opposition. There are commercial interests that profit greatly in keeping things the way they are. And my most recent example is that banks charge these fees on checking accounts that extract over $38 billion of money from poor people each and every year. $38 billion is huge, bigger than almost all other programs. Everyone knows the problem. No one really can defend that you've got 10% of the households who have checking accounts paying for. We've done away with the fairness doctrine, which said that when a commercial interest can have an op-ed position, there has to be a equal amount of time provided in the public media. The Supreme Court is very close, perhaps, to now doing away with any restrictions on commercial speech, which means any kind of money directly into campaigns will be unlimited. And that old adage that when a society has its government run by commercial interests, that is the definition of fascism. And we seem to be on that trail, even through a depression-like scenario. So I'm wondering, how can a foundation, if there's not, and can you have the strength to stand up, to those old Frederick Douglass quotes of saying anything that is worth fighting for, you have to struggle and fight. It's not the creation of a light bulb idea. It is oppositional in democracy between sort of equal competing ideas, but it's not equal.
And I think Susan B. Anthony had a good quote to that too. Who would like to answer Martin's question? I mean, two responses, Martin. I mean, excellent points. You know, we've been big champions of the earned income tax credit in rural communities, and looking at how hard we work to get a little more cash into our families, and how predatory, practices and banking practices suck it all right back out. And it was a long time to create the earned income tax credit under President Nixon, right? And we work hard to get more people signed up for it, and then the predatory lenders are right there on income tax return day. Clearly, some of the innovations in the unbanked, looking at projects that might have looked like developing country projects, like cell phones that provide banking and direct deposit, looking for, I'm sure you guys have looked at many of these ideas, that, ways that still make it, you have to compete in the marketplace. What's that person offering you? How do I offer that? I've looked at some social entrepreneurs looking at the cell phone platform with banking and direct deposit and even micro lending there, and not in developing countries, but in the U.S. But your other issue is, even if we came up with that, how would the organized interest oppose it? I can only say that in other areas, this one, I know Michael Barr, the professor of Michigan, is working in the administration, has written a lot about the unbanked. In other areas where unusual suspects from the business world become champions around some issue of public policy because they've gotten involved philanthropically. We're certainly seeing it in early childhood. But there again, it's like, well, who's against early childhood? The thorny ones. And I guess this goes back to the unique opportunity of private foundations with no shareholders. I mean, you're right to say a private foundation could take this on, because it is not, nobody can stop buying its product, and it's accountable only to the IRS. And I think, I don't know, in your discussions with funders, obviously, it doesn't make sense to work so hard to get a few dollars of IDA or earned income tax credit into someone's work when you see $38 billion going out in other practices. So I think you've crystallized the issue. Again, I think some philanthropists who sort of say, I'm not going to work that hard if it's going to be taken away, that want to take on some of those industries. They obviously won't come from those industries, but having worked with new donors in Silicon Valley, it was surprising. People like Reed Hastings that got on the state school board and became a champion for charter schools because he saw that school boards were one of the biggest obstacles to school reform. He didn't go for vouchers. So I think we need more unusual suspects, I think, that would take on, and those numbers are pretty attractive. If I were a philanthropist saying, like, 38, if I can change that through regulation or policy, now of course I really want to find ways to stop predatory, payday and income tax day, predatory lending, because it's just crazy to work that hard.
You can do all the philanthropy in the world in Detroit, and Detroit has been a wildfire. The destruction, I mean, I'm not telling you anything new. It didn't matter what you did as good models if you allowed someone to come in and burn down
other larger forces.
Infrastructure.
Let me just make a couple of comments in response to the very interesting question that Mark raised. The truth is that there have been examples of foundations taking on corporate interests. And indeed, one of the points I make in the book is that one of the most important roles of foundations is, in fact, to challenge corporate interests and to challenge the government as well. And foundations have done this. When you think about the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation taking on the cigarette industry nationally and mobilizing anti-smoking groups in every single state of the union, giving them the money to wage campaigns to raise the taxes on cigarettes. Now, that's a very good example, and what's more, it's not only a good example, it succeeded for all practical purposes in getting those taxes imposed, in pricing cigarettes out of the reach of the younger people. They're trying to do exactly the same thing with respect to obesity issues, where they're really sparking opposition to the God knows, the big soft drink companies, the snack companies, with respect to sales of those efforts. But I think I go even further. The truth is that many people I've spoken with in who are heading foundations, that is donors, founding donors of foundations, or in some cases foundations themselves. But the donors have gotten so impatient about the inability of their foundations to do the work. They've restructured the foundations, and they basically created hybrid structures so that in fact they create funds that can go right into the organizing of lobbying of one sort or another. So the big movement, and this is not a sales pitch for this paperback edition, but the paperback edition does in fact include a section in the introduction that talks about, at more length than I want to spend you all's time doing right now, that talks about the fact that there have been any number of initiatives by major donors. Julian Robertson is one of them, who has actually created a foundation, but he's not paying the president of the foundation out of the foundation. He's paying it personally, so the guy can engage lobbyists to engage in the environmental causes and try to get legislation through mobilized groups. If you look, for example, at some of the cases that Ford that are in the book that were written up, of examples of how Ford created lobbies. What is the NRDC today, besides the most politically active lobby in the environmental world? And what are they doing? They're the ones who wrote, between the NRDC and EDC, they're the ones who actually, environmental defense, they're the ones who wrote the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and have mounted lawsuits in order to force the government to enforce those acts. So, I think, that where we are now is foundations, many foundations. Atlantic Philanthropy, where I used to work, has set up a $250 million fund that is a 501c4 for the purpose of taking on issues legislatively through lobbying. So, there are many. Why haven't more foundations done this before? Well, a lot of the private foundations really, the rules are pretty strict, and you don't want to get too close to the line if you're a trustee. And if you've got an energetic, typical lawyer general counsel, he wants to tell you that you can't do anything. Talk to Rebecca Reimel about her experience with the general counsels at Pew. And she finally just decided, well, the only way to solve the problem is to become a public charity. We'll just do whatever we want to do, which is what they did. It's not very many foundations can do that. So the point is that if foundations were willing to engage themselves much more energetically, which they can do legally in the advocacy world, taking on issues, taking on specific industries, then there are a lot of things that could happen, because the signal successes in the public policy arena is where publicly oriented money, public spirited money went into the process. Why are we where we are right now, for example, to take the big issue, health? Where we are right now is, look at the money that the Kaiser Family Foundation has put into this field, the Commonwealth Foundation has put into this field, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has put into this field, generating enormous amounts not only of data, but organizing groups to get engaged in trying to bring about health policy reform in this country. 15 years ago, those groups weren't there. But in the interim, between 1992 and now, those foundations and probably 3 dozen others have put together war chests to fight the issue of health policy reform. So I think your diagnosis is too negative. I think that there are very good examples where foundations have cut loose and are really saying, we're going to make a difference, because their boards are impatient with what they can do, what they've been doing, because they've not been aggressive enough, they've not been advocacy-oriented enough, or also because the donors themselves are saying, look, I interviewed Eli Broad, and he's very impatient about what the millions, the hundreds of millions he's put into education reform have been able to achieve. And he said to me very frankly, he says, I don't know whether we're really accomplishing anything. He said, I think we just got to be much more activist about what we're doing. And I think that's what a lot of people I interviewed said. So I would not only not despair, I would say that the foundation sector and the nonprofit sector, particularly the foundation sector, which activates with the money that it can, groups like, when NRDC, the Ford Foundation gave the first grants to NRDC, there were 4 guys who came to Ford for the money. NRDC now has upwards of 800,000 paying members every year and is a politically effective presence in bringing about change in the environmental arena. Why was the House able to pass cap and trade? Because half a dozen major foundations have put hundreds of millions of dollars into environmental policy research over the course of the last 20 years or 25 years that have brought that about. So, I mean, I just think there are plenty of examples of what can happen if there is frustration. I think there's real frustration on all these issues in all the foundations that deal with them. And I think we're going to see a new day. I think we're already seeing a new day. I didn't mean to go on.
And I don't mean to be too pessimistic, but when I take health policy right now, there a lot of the town meetings with all the anger are literally plants that the Dick Armey machine has been sending out with very strong corporate funding in order to say, well, there is no consensus around health reform, even though it's not true. If you have a loud enough voice, it appears. I mean, look at what happened to Acorn just in the last week. Yes, they made big mistakes, but there were organized oppositional groups that have been putting in tens of millions of dollars to destroy a Van Jones, to destroy.
I can't disagree with that. It's happening, but that's democracy.
The mixed system.
Well, I'm all for the mix and swords. If one person's playing a duel, you know, with a band cap, and the other one's got a sword, it doesn't renew democracy. So I love the title. I want to hear more examples.
I just think as Joel described, some foundation is going to have the fun of taking the issue you described and saying that's the one we're going to tackle. And you must know some of those people, Mark.
Well, the one that was the most active in the field got ground up in the Madoff thing. I mean,
They were great.
That was.
They're putting in $35 million a year in a lot of these issues that you're talking about. I don't know whether they're working specifically on predatory lending, but they're putting their whole budget, $35 million every year, went just evaporated. It was the Legion Foundation in Boston putting the money into the Jet Foundation.
Jet.
Completely evaporated.
Let's get some more.
Other questions, points? Yes.
Thank you so much for your discussion. And I'm a graduate student, and I'm interested in international food security. I saw that you had some operations, significant operations in sub-Saharan Africa. And so my question has to do with kind of how in these countries you're seeing a huge youth population, more than half the population often under the age of 18, and major food crisis issues. Do you foresee more coordination between the areas you described, like education and food, in these international countries? Because while there's coordination maybe in the United States between, students being able to eat at school, things like that, free lunches, programs like that, there's a gap in coordination in a lot of these countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So do you see more coordination between those areas, not just that those areas are going to be pursued?
We're really sub-Saharan. We're down in southern Africa and the contiguous, Botswana, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Swaziland, and Malawi. Actually, through our mission-driven investing, we're in a fund of funds down there looking at agricultural. I mean, we in our 20-some years in southern Africa, we have probably funded any food stuff that's ripe for small production, from honey to beef to cassava to pineapples to cashews, you name it. If it's grown in that region, we have looked at ways to organize local growers either through co-ops or commodity groups. You're linked, though, to the youth, and the fact is, in developing countries, it's still often better to be poor in a rural community rather than move to the city. I mean, and you see that in the townships. So you're absolutely right. To the extent that there is a way for agricultural production to support economic development in rural communities, we, especially take South Africa, where there is a mandate for a transfer of assets held by white South Africans pre-apartheid to transfer them over. Well, of course, you can imagine the first assets that get transferred are those that are at the bottom of the heap in terms of the portfolio. And so we met a tribe that had bought a cashew plantation, trees that had been planted too close together, when we brought TechnoServe in to analyze their business, they said, we might stabilize the patient, but this patient, will never be healthy. But they looked at the land base the tribe and the chief controlled, and even the cashew plantation was creating jobs that were the best paying jobs for probably 100 kilometers around there. But they looked and they said, what could you grow here? Well, they could grow golden pineapples. And I saw the nursery with 50,000 pineapples about to go into production in which they would be instantly successful and profitable. That seems too easy sometimes, which is what's the right crop in the right place. And it would employ almost all the people in that tribe and probably lots of others going forward. But I still think we're looking for actually for-profit ways to invest. We met one of the biggest suppliers of honey in South Africa, a white South African, who really was an engineer, but he started keeping bees when he was 14, and he had this successful honey business, and he just wanted to go back to keeping bees, and he wanted to sell this business to a co-op of black South Africans. He wanted to teach people to keep bees, and he had done the math on 20 sets of hives in a rural area would be, so again, you're looking at opportunities for the transfer, but I think that's still very much in the infancy. Of course, Norman Borlaug just died this week, the father of the Green Revolution, and of course the controversy was also reported, but it was interesting to see how that strategy in Mexico, where Borlaug started, actually did have a huge effect. But I do think we need to look at micro regions. The Green Revolution wasn't very effective where there wasn't water. Latin America profited a lot better. But I wish I could talk with you more offline about some of the things we're doing. We're also in too many countries in Southern Africa, when I said 7. Anyway.
I'm sorry Joel was gone after that eloquent defense of the 2 dozen foundations which have actually done work of that sort, as opposed to the 50,000 which have not. But let's go to an area in which of the 2 dozen have made their efforts, which is still one of your areas of interest. And tell me how it is that 45 years after the Great Society of the War on Poverty, you people, with all your money and your not sustained interest, have not been able to deal with the simplest of rural poverty societies in this country, Mississippi. As many failed carcasses as there are all over the place, and the sporadic nature of the intervention, nonetheless, it has been a laboratory for a lot of your pet theories. Now, why has it failed?
I can't.
If it is such an easy thing to do of foundations putting their resources in and sustaining it. I mean, what bothers me about the argument, and it goes even to a larger question, actually is the larger question, which is a lot of the unintended consequences of those things which are hailed in the first instance as great successes and are not sustained long enough to find out what the answer may be to the consequence of the success. But luckily, you've never had any success in Mississippi. So tell me about this one, because it really gives me a continuing. I said I was sorry that after you gave your speech about the 2 dozen foundations that did great things, we didn't have a chance to talk about the 50,000 we haven't. But other than
99.
yeah, I understand, but those numbers up all the time, and I just was trying to keep it de minimis. Anyway,
I certainly can't.
Because I as you know, with 2 organizations I'm with, we depend on Kellogg's occasional good works in Mississippi and other people's occasional good works.
I came to Kellogg. We had been in the Mid-South Delta region in the 3 states there in the northeast part of Mississippi for about 10 years with strictly an economic development approach. It wasn't education, it wasn't health, it wasn't civic engagement really. So I don't have an answer hiding. All I can say is, I said, if we haven't had much success, and we've been there for 10 years, and we want to take a place-based approach, and the storm, Hurricane Katrina, pulled us down to the Gulf Coast too, so we got more exposure to the state. I said, I think we should stay and broaden our approach. I do note, as you chronicled, I know a lot of national funders that keep coming back to the Deep South and say, what can we do in the Southeast? What can we do? They want to work there. Someone just at the meeting with the Secretary of Education said they failed miserably in Mississippi. I'm trying to think which foundation it was, but people come.
It doesn't matter.
I guess So I guess one thing is I'm glad at least on a map I can say I'm going to be in Mississippi, and I didn't feel it's effective to declare a 10-year initiative on some project, because I think long-term commitment to vulnerable kids in certain places says we will be accountable for moving that needle. Whatever levers help that happen. Now, I note the tobacco tax in Mississippi on a pack of tobacco is on cigarettes is like 25 cents. It's or 25 or 35 cents. It's that's right. So, I mean, this probably does go back to civic engagement and the idea of helping people help themselves. I find in the little I know of Mississippi an incredible resilience, a pride in a civil rights movement and some of those victories, but still kids in a state whose economy stays at 50th. So I probably could answer your question better in 5 or 10 years when I can say I went to Mississippi and tried. I'm just saying at least all of this framework will be working in Mississippi and not just a rural economic development one. Teach for America wanted to send 200 new recruits into the Delta. But that's again one lever of change, which is sending a young, talented teacher for a few years, a concentrated approach maybe to saturate a certain part of the country or a certain part of a state. But you're right.
That's a great idea.
The endowments being good things to do with foundation money. David Halberstam's name to put quite a few Teach for America people into Mississippi on a sustained basis. But I've scratched my itch. Let me ask you a question which goes to the same point. When they were debating and coming to a resolution about how to handle what became the war on poverty, there were any number of suggestions as to how to approach it. In the end, there was that we can't afford to abandon anybody approach, which meant that you took limited resources and instead of concentrating on those who were coming, you concentrated across the board, at the end of which none of it had adequate support for what needed to be done. I was going to ask you again, as much money as you foundations have, I don't understand this necessity for saying that you've got to do it all. I mean, and I think that right now, Gates is going one end of the age spectrum when it comes to this. Why wouldn't you concentrate on the early period?
I think one interesting theme is, the related question is, can you be strategic by focusing on all of it in one place? In other words, if 2 million people in Mississippi is not a huge population. You could maybe employ all of this framework. When Jeff Canada does it in the Harlem Children's Zone, he started out with one goal, end generational poverty. He didn't have a framework or a lever. He just said, that's what I want to do. And he's sort of built his program every time he figured out, including running his own schools. Now the federal government's going to try to replicate that. And we've already been through a decade or two of comprehensive community initiatives that haven't shown a lot of results. On the other hand, it was a question I had in reading the foundation again, which is, can place be an organizing principle for strategy? So that if you say, I'm not going to I could either say, I'm going to work only in early childhood all over the country, or I'm going to work from birth into college attainment in a few places and do every possible thing I think it takes. The hardest one, of course, is this family economic security, I think, which is if there aren't jobs, tackling, and you go back to the war on poverty, taking on poverty and figuring out how, even Jeff Canada said to our board last week, he said, I tried to have a jobs program. I failed. So all I focus on is getting more resources into my family's coffers through IDAs and earning, but no employment strategy other than educational attainment for the kids there. He is committed to babies born, staying with them the whole way. I do think it does take generational strategies, and you can't do so. I agree. I mean, I would defend any foundation that says we think. I think delivering a 5-year-old whose family has been involved in their development for the first 5 years of their life to kindergarten would be a huge accomplishment. And I would ask people, what would you be willing to spend to deliver a 5-year-old with a family ready to be their educational ally and support for all the way into college? What would you put on that? And I think a foundation should ask that question, because you could say, it's expensive, But the cost of failure, I can spend up to the cost of predictable failure, I guess. And there again, I think you will see another generation of place-based work, whether it's in the city of Grand Rapids or the city of Albuquerque. Again, we want to go where funders are clustered, and we'd like to encourage some of our colleagues to come wherever we are. And that's why, in declaring 3 states as 3 states of focus, I told 47 others that I'm not going to do much in your state, although half, I threw out it 2 years ago, I said maybe half our budget ought to go to the state approach. In a year or two, people were acting like that was just what we were going to do. Half of our budget was going to go into the states. It wasn't scientifically determined. And to your argument, you might say, why not put all of your money into those 3 states? And even that might not get you there. But I think we should be subject to the question you say, which is how much dosage, frequency, and durability are we doing to get the change we want? And it's not on one indicator.
Question. My wife grew up in Detroit, and she now spends 1 week a month in Detroit. She's there today, working on trying to do something about Detroit's problems. I'm very curious. What are you doing in your own backyard in Detroit?
Well,
How much money are you spending?
Being located in a small town in western Michigan, I grew up in Detroit. I didn't know much about the western part of the state. Now that I live in western Michigan, I understand it's like every state. I could describe it in Mississippi too. It's interesting how states feel so divided by their regions. Whereas I want to think people identify as Michiganders or New Mexicans or Mississippians, and they do. But that will also tell you how different those people are west of 55 or those people in Detroit from the western part of the state. The first thing I did when I got to the Kellogg Foundation was get to know my colleagues and the funding community over in Detroit. The Kresge Foundation, Rip Rapson is new there. The Community Foundation, the Skillman Foundation. I think big private foundations, when they fund nationally or even in their own home state, tend to come in with their own initiatives and don't pay attention to the local ecology. And so we've got a great set of collaborative relationships among the funders in Detroit. And we pooled with Ford and the Knight Foundation. We pooled $100 million for a new economy initiative. And we expect to work with all those people on school reform. We have a new chief financial officer. We have a new mayor. I think my hometown has, your wife's hometown has hit the bottom. But having Dave Bing, a businessman and former basketball star, and Robert Bobb as the chief financial officer, it feels like there's a chance for a new day in Detroit. But again, it comes back to what people want for their communities, and it is a question of aspirations and their sense of hope or possibility. Jeff Canada said last week to our board, he said, when adults let bad things happen in their community, they lose their community. He was talking about drug dealers and public housing in his project. And he went and sat with those adults, and they were he said 80% of them wanted to do the right thing, but they felt trapped. Now, I think some of the hardest places we work, people feel trapped. And we have to figure out a way. We cannot change the world if they don't want to change the world for themselves. I think the people in Detroit have been in a long downward spiral for some time for a variety of reasons. But philanthropy is going to be there. The fact that we have the Mott Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, three of the largest private foundations in the country, as well as other colleagues there, it gives me reason to have some hope. Everyone's going to compete for Promise Zone money now when we try to replicate the Harlem Children's Zone. I worry that when you try to replicate at scale with public dollars, you really lose all the critical success factors that made that project work. So I hope the communities around the country that may want to pursue a comprehensive approach don't bet on the federal RFP, but say, look, if you're serious about it, talk to your funders and pull it together. What Martin described in terms of the devastation of the subprime experience, it hit the northern black belt. It hit Cleveland, and it came right up into, it followed the census tracts where middle-class blacks lived in our state being the most segregated state in the country by the definition of segregation.
Wiped out 20% of black homeowners nationwide.
I want to tell you one more story. I know we're getting close to the end, but just another plate maybe for a little optimism. In revolutionizing the delivery of oral health care to vulnerable kids and families in this country. And it's an example where the foundation is playing the driver role. And it's the serendipity of opening the mail and looking at a grant request. I'm hoping somebody opens their mail and sees your great idea on $38 billion and will say this is a great thing. This grant request came 3 years ago from the tribes of Alaska that were looking for a way to get basic dental care to their rural villages. This is not a problem unique to rural Alaska. Our inner cities, most poor kids do not see a dentist, get no regular hygiene, do not get routine restorative cavity work done. Well, the tribes of Alaska that ran their own health system discovered a program in New Zealand that was 30 years old that trained high school graduates for 2 years to do basic restorative cavity repair in people's mouths. And it recruited people usually from the villages and places where they were going to practice. And they sent some tribal professionals down to New Zealand to be trained. Well, I guess they weren't professionals at the time. And they applied to us for some support to try to bring the training closer to home. And the last couple of years, we came to know the program. And I looked at it and I said, the revolution in healthcare that happened 20 and 30 years ago in the creation of nurse practitioners and certified nurse midwives and physician's assistants had not come to dentistry. And I looked at the Kellogg Foundation's legacy of working in the allied health professions, in medicine and in public health and in nurse practitioners and with dentists. And I said, this isn't just a great idea for the tribes of Alaska. This is how dentistry should be practiced in the United States. We should have a dental therapist, mid-level provider that would be cost-effective and would extend health care, would not require more money, but would be a job training program. And the practice was 30 years proven in 50 other countries. Well, the question is, do you wait 20 or 30 years, like fighting tobacco? In this case, would some members of organized dentistry see this as competitive, as I'm sure many doctors did 30 years ago? And here's a foundation, and in fact, when we made this grant, the president of the American Dental Association called our board chair up a few days before the board meeting. And this was just a grant to support some more training in Alaska, or for Alaska. The University of Washington Dental School was asked if they would help provide the training. Well, they were threatened, I think, with loss of accreditation if they did. University of Washington Medical School then agreed to do some clinical training. But we said, well, we can predict the opposition. Although, of course, economically, it's a win-win for the entire world of dentistry, because with tens of thousands of people losing their teeth in their mouths, keeping people healthy with good teeth just sets them up for all the other kind of restorative care they need the rest of their lives. Turns out we have the same number of dental schools we had in 1950, and some are now at risk of closing and downsizing. So there's no other than the toothmobile that comes around once a year with those volunteer dentists, which is a wonderful gesture of service. So I said to my staff, I said, there's much more potential here than just expanding this, possibly to other tribes. It was interesting, the American Dental Association then filed suit in Anchorage to try to stop this, and realized they probably didn't have standing since this was an Indian Health Service program. It didn't require a change in state law or federal law. But they ended up, I think they realized when they were asked what plans did organized dentistry have to getting care to tens of thousands of people that routinely don't, there was a resounding silence. Well, then this year in Minnesota, a group of healthcare activists and reformers somehow got passed in the state legislature a bill that said Minnesota ought to have a mid-level dental therapist provider practice, some type. They didn't know what. They didn't know of this model in Alaska, New Zealand. But someone else was thinking, time for mid-level dentistry to start getting codified. And my program officer said, that's interesting. But he said, but I'm supposed to be working on the tribes. I said, no, Al. I said, this is a breakthrough. If that happened in Minnesota, we now have to think about how we could support state by state the change in the code of practice and what it will take. And again, do we want to wait 20 years to reach some tipping point, or can we, as Gladwell really points out, it's amazing how fast some social change can happen if done thoughtfully through mavens and other things. Well, in just a year or two, and we just approved $12 million grant last week to really be a driver on this project, the oral funders together. There are 3 questions about this issue, which is, how long will it take to get this person trained? Under what kind of supervision can they practice? And its length of training, supervision, and their scope of practice. The fact is, it appears now that the question is not if this will happen, but how fast it will happen. And there are at least 5 other states, as well as dental associations, as well as the Children's Dental Health Project in Washington, as well as the Association of Dental Hygienists. Dental hygienists now look at this and say, if I have an associate degree, hygiene degree, and I've been out practicing for 5 or 10 years, you give me 1 year of training, because I know the mouth, and I know this part of dentistry. Give me 1 year of technical training, and I can be a dental therapist and do basic restorative cavity work. That's a huge job opportunity for tens of thousands of dental hygienists. So they've already become our allies. The dental schools and some dentists want it to be a 4-year program, a 6-year program. Of course, the academy, but again, to me, as when you focus on vulnerable children and their access to basic health care, and you see the data on dental care, and then you see this opportunity to make a change in 3 years or 5 years, not 20 or 30, you shouldn't skimp on your resources. And you have to figure out how to be both a driver and a collaborator. And we're working with everybody else in the field across many states with some state dental associations. And the question is just how fast and how quickly this can happen, and how soon poor kids and families in inner cities, anywhere you find them, would be getting basic dental care. So it's one of those things that walks in your door and you look at it carefully and you say, this could revolutionize the practice of dentistry and be an incredible employment and cost-effective way. So we're going to talk to the Medicaid office, we're talking to the Indian Health Service, but it's exciting where on one project you can suddenly say, if you step up to it, and not just say we need to get it to one more tribe in the lower 48 or maybe one other state. So stay tuned. I hope we'll be able to, if you start to hear about this, I think pretty quickly organized dentistry, all parts of it, hygienists, dentists, and others will say, this is good for our field. But I don't have a crystal ball right now.
Just to change the subject a little bit, a question about how philanthropy learns through your foundation. So my perception is that foundations are lousy at learning, particularly long term. So when you think about the Kellogg Foundation just as an example, where you've had many Delta initiatives over the years, it's always been my sense that there's very little intergenerational learning between program officers, between foundations. The culture doesn't support it. There's no infrastructure to support it, and there's a huge amount lost. The question is, why haven't we been successful in Mississippi? I think it's a lot because people haven't had the time and the opportunity to learn and reflect and share and pass that knowledge on. So I just wonder what your perception is about your foundation or about philanthropy's ability to learn in terms of tackling these tough problems.
It's a great question. I think part of the answer is in the issue that if a foundation doesn't stay with a goal for a long period of time, and the second thing is there is no cost, as there is in the corporate sector, of walking away from a project. In the corporate sector, you don't say, I'm tired of making Tylenol, let's stop. You stay with something so long as it's profitable, and you don't invest in R&D or make mistakes that that you learn because there are penalties. In the foundation, I agree there are so many publications on lessons learned, and Ed and I were talking about this before, that seem to be repeating common sense homilies over and over. Like it takes more time, you have to build trust, relationships are important. I mean, these are fundamental issues in our work which ought to be part of the craft. But too many initiatives come and go with profound lessons possibly learned. And when I came to the foundation, they said, we had this great middle school program called Middle Start about 8 years ago. I said, what happened? I mean, why did we go to middle schools and why did we leave? What were the lessons learned? And you're right, well, we're not in that business anymore. So those lessons really don't, we might have published something that actually had some profound things in it, but you're right, so we switch our businesses, we're in this school-based health clinics, we're in it for a while, so it's true that I think you need a more robust goals framework that says, what are we trying to achieve, and what are the ways we're trying to achieve it? So no costs for ignoring lessons learned, and as I was saying, Ed, my board is pretty serious about I don't think a lesson is learned until it has actually influenced and changed behavior. So what they're curious about on that classic, plan, do, assess, and then adapt, they want to see every part of that loop. And when you're planning, of course, you should be saying, what did we learn in the last 10 years and what does the field know? Again, it's all available to us. I will say, too, organized philanthropy is not so organized. Our ability to capture knowledge and organize it is so far behind the rest of the internet world. There are great internet sites where if you type in 18th century women poets, it will take you to an art site that will actually let you go in 20 different directions based on that interest. If I was a new donor that cared about teenage pregnancy, where would I go to find out? I'd hire some smart person to do an assessment, and I'd get that report, and then it might or might not inform my work. But we have not captured knowledge. It's not organized. It's not like we're like the academy where at least they say, you have to read this, then you build on the literature. It's now, and again, I think all foundations want to be learning organizations, but the incentives and rewards and the context for it don't exist. And as I said, I'm surprised how knowledge is free in our field, but it also sometimes has no value. Does anybody want to read a report I put out, or is that, well, that's Kellogg's report? Why would I read that? I mean, I tend, when I came into the field and when I taught my seminar and had to learn about 100 years of organized philanthropy, I was shocked at the lessons and the accomplishments of Carnegie and Rockefeller and Rosenwald and I realized, and Sage. I was like, oh my gosh, these people have thought about these things and figured them out. But nobody, when I came into philanthropy in 1986, said, now Sterling, first you got to do a master's, you got to read, and so we have these classes. But again, I think victory will go to those foundations that either pick fewer goals and study it and keep contributing to that. But we have a whole new, we have a director of learning and innovation at our foundation. We had evaluators, but evaluators are seen as the cops, and the evaluators always come in after the program and just tell you all the things you did wrong, but they don't then put up on the wall, this is how we have changed based on that bad action. So I think your question is sort of the Achilles heel of our field, which is knowledge is free for the taking, and this is the big accountability issue. See, I don't think Congress and the American public hate us when we spend too much money on ourselves and we get into scandals, but they rarely really ask us, what problem, how are you getting better? How's your R&D going? What are you getting better at, or what are you struggling with? I mean, it would be great that if the IRS wasn't the agency we were accountable to, but that the Department of Education actually said to us, we need these 5 things figured out. Which of you foundations want to do R&D? The Department of Health and Human Services says, here's the questions we're asking. I have a friend who's an Undersecretary of Education, and she said to me, Sterling, I'm a grant maker. I give away several billions of dollars a year to great projects. And I thought, wow, I mean, we knew that people hate to say government is the ultimate philanthropist because our conservative friends say, that's not philanthropy, that's tax dollars. But it is still a pool of money that's supposed to go into innovation and R&D and sustainability. So I hope we'll get some breakthroughs in our generation around the knowledge capture and organization so that so that we don't get people, when I counseled new donors in Silicon Valley, I wanted them to come in with a fresh approach and on a napkin figure out how to solve social problems. But they too often reinvented the wheel rather than reinventing philanthropy. That they really should have said, well, tell me everything you know about teen pregnancy prevention so that I can then try the next new thing. And it was no easy way to do that unless they happened to meet somebody that was a great practitioner at the front of their field. So that's a great challenge.
Are you saying then that technology, the they, and are they?
Well, I think it's more, we have affinity groups, we have grant makers in health, we have grant makers for education, we've got so many affinity groups. You could start with the affinity groups and say, organize your knowledge. You exist to network and be peers. Organize your knowledge so that a layperson on Google could access it too. On my website, redesigned in a few months, if I'm promoting racial equity and you came to my website, what the heck do they mean by that? What are they doing? I'd want to reference you. Here are the here are our inspirational gurus. Here's the people we read. Here's the facts we're taking into consideration. But funders, again, who wants to fund that knowledge capture? We're too busy trying to change the world or not change the world. And again, you say, well, how will you organize it? Who will use it? Who's the customer? But I still think we're right at that doorstep, which is someone must try it. Just the way we need to figure out what does digital and social media, how will that help change the world? You know, we oldsters didn't grow up with it, but we obviously want to say, in take civic engagement. You know, what's the digital approach to civic engagement? I don't want to say social networking is also civic networking, but people should be obviously on that frontier asking, and we saw how a campaign was run that way, but we don't know how a government is run that way. So it's a good question. And more funders, bigger funders who can fund capacity or just exploratory projects ought to say this is a knowledge project, let's organize the knowledge here, and maybe use a panel of new donors to say, and there were all these wonderful seminars for wealthy people that were created in the last decade to do one-on-one peer training on how to be a good philanthropist. But frankly, many of those donors are like, I just go to the web, right? They just want to go to the web, do their tutorial, find the smartest people out there, and go to a TED lecture or something, and then go out and do it. That's what we should organize for them.
Okay, Leslie, let's take two more. I want to make just a short statement that we're working with Lucy Bernholtz, who some of you may know, to do a paper which is in draft form now on philanthropy and technology's effects on philanthropy now, and speculating with some of the smartest folks around. And by turn of the year, we should have this beginning paper and hopefully beginning network that's going to ramify and really talk about some fascinating stuff that no one seems to say much about. Leslie and then Barry, and we'll close.
So you've talked about almost every box up there except for racial equity, which you just referred to, and I think that it's a pervasive, perplexing problem and one that is difficult for foundations to address and difficult actually to know whether you're making any difference if you do try to address it. So what are your kind of thoughts about how you go about addressing institutional and individual racism and racial disequities, and how you know whether you've done it?
Right. I can't answer all those questions. Let me.
Any of them. Any subset.
If I have internet access here, and I think I might, I wanted to go to our website real quick. Is that the only place it goes?
Yeah, then you've got to
It's got to go.
Yeah.
I just want to show you. I want to show you something pertaining to racial equity, and there it is. I think I was talking about that earlier. I think the experience with Professor Gates most recently, or the Attorney General saying we're all cowards. And having grown up in the '60s myself with the discovery of institutional racism, when our cities were burning, when the Kerner Commission told us we lived in two societies, and 40 years later, the power as an older white male of civilizations to mystify their disparities, and to the point where the reactions to the Gates episode were just predictable in terms of how people would respond, does sort of suggest, and for us, looking at vulnerable kids who both for poverty and race, the disparities in health and education and economics come back so often in our country to the racial divide. So you can attack school reform and school change and back into issues of race, or by putting it out in front of you, say, look, wherever you go and you deal with disparities, you will run into race. And yet our society, whenever race comes up or we try to have conversations, and credit to Governor Winter Harding, who was the one who asked President Clinton to try to have the nation have a conversation on race, and now has the Winter Institute that we support in Mississippi, that just one thing you can do is this is like civic engagement, have people whose full-time job is to support people when race comes up. And at least if you don't have that resource, it's like, okay, then you'll always get the conversation halfway down, and then people will go back to their corners. It's made a difference to us, the composition of our board. And this goes to accountability and transparency, that the fact that half my board members are people of color. I was almost half female, too, and we're working to bring that back into, is that not going anywhere? This one? Oh, thank you. It's sitting right at me. Sorry.
Speaking of sharing information, how many other foundations have boards which are half who don't look like me?
Not many. We have that data. One of my trustees going down to the University of Arkansas, the Clinton School, to talk about that next week. But it's true. The evidence, ours was an all-white, almost all-white male board until 1983. 1984. Yeah, is it still not? Trying. I have 3 Internet Explorer things.
There it
Is it there?
Yeah.
No?
That's the default.
I just want to close some of these. I think I opened. Not that one. Hello. You can close that one. I think it's trying to get to there. There's no question a foundation can pursue goals and objectives depending on its staff and its trustees. When I interviewed for my job with the Kellogg Foundation, I'd never been to the Kellogg Foundation. I was on the 35th floor of a high-rise in Chicago. And it was only after my second interview I went home and I knew they were a diverse group of people, and I realized there was only one white male on that board of directors. And our board, under my predecessor's leadership, Bill Richardson, had a 10-year initiative on capitalizing on diversity. And before him, predecessors had worked on some issues. The staff had gone through healing racism workshops. Every member of the staff went through at least 2 days of training. And yet the literature says if there's not an authorizing environment in organizations for this change at the top, that you can only go so far. And many of the staff, it was clear, weren't really sure how the board felt about this work. And in fact, in trying to increase diversity in our grant making, some staff members had felt they had been sort of gone into the boardroom and had been, really not been successful. So I, being new to the foundation, brought the same trainers that were working with the staff in to work with the board for a series of workshops over several months. And at the conclusion of those workshops, the trainer said to the board, "What do you want to do?" And my board said, "We want to be the most effective anti-racist organization we can be." I went back and shared that with the staff, at least to let them know if they were worried about an authorizing environment to strive against an issue that's haunted our country since its beginning, there was no question that their board was supportive. And in fact, even using the term anti-racist had its own provocative. And when I was recruiting new vice presidents to join us, that attracted candidates. It also scared people, and it caused many conversations. But as we started focusing on Mr. Kellogg's commitment to vulnerable kids and asked ourselves what causes vulnerability, the issue of race kept coming up. I'm proud to say now that we talk about racial equity and racial disparities all the time at the foundation. It's just matter of fact now, whereas before people would have felt, you're bringing it up, wonder who's going to be bothered. So it matters hugely, of course, who's on your governors. And they're, to Martin's point, they want to be bold. But one of my trustees has said, but we're not a civil rights organization. That's the advocates. We're a shirt sleeves Midwestern foundation that just cares about vulnerable kids. But gosh and golly, it's kids of color whenever we turn around in our own hometown of Battle Creek or in Detroit or anywhere in Mississippi, anywhere in New Mexico. So that's become part of our culture right now. Our challenge is, our Vice President, Gail Christopher, that's leading our racial equity work, well, here we're being a catalyst, not a driver, because we put out an RFP, Classic Foundation, we want to dismantle structural racism, we want to promote racial healing. Let's put out an RFP to the world, to the country, and ask people, what are you doing? Would you like some resources? Just as a way to assess the state of the field. The deadline is September 30th, and the RFP's been out for several months. We started averaging 25 to 30 calls a day, just people wanting to find out more. We already have $23 million worth of requests and expect an avalanche up to on the September 30th. We don't even know if our servers are going to crash when all these electronic applications come in. But my staff said, well, gee, the board's actually approved a $75 million 5-year commitment to this work. But private foundations, or a lot of foundations, are so eager to announce from the ramparts the dollars and the initiative, and yet we rarely hear at the end of 5 or 10 years the results. They usually end with a whimper, or they just go off. We don't have lessons learned. And taking on racial equity or racial healing or structural racism, I said, I do not want to announce to anybody this commitment. It's a fantastic commitment, but I don't want to then be in the limelight of saying, oh, what are you doing and how are you going to solve this problem? I'd rather say, let's put the money out, let's start learning about the work, and let's see quietly where we start to see things changing, or whether we run into the same brick walls that so many other people have. But please do not, it's easy to announce an initiative and commit millions of dollars to it. It's hard to change the world. So let's talk about changing the world when we see change, and not about just foundation makes grant to tackle big hard problem. So, yeah. Although my communications team says, hey, branding, differentiation, it's a chance to differentiate. But it's like, yeah, I'd rather be talking about it 5 or 10 years from now about this is what's happening. Maybe we'll support, I said in Michigan, it's looking at the Winter Institute in Mississippi, seems to me if you don't have dedicated NGOs to do this work, you're not going to move it. I mean, that's what we've seen. As Joel said, if the capacity's there, if we build new institutions that do this as their full-time work, then we start to see change. Well, how many institutions are supported full-time to deal with racial healing, or to dismantling structural racism, or just helping people talk? So your question, not just individuals, of course, most Americans, and the Frameworks Institute's done some powerful research here, most Americans think we have solved, as came up in the Gates event, that racism is illegal. That racism that still exists is in the hearts of individuals, and that's really hard to change. But no commentary on the legacy of disenfranchisement and lack of wealth that haunts the black middle class is 20 times more susceptible at falling out of middle class status than the white middle class. I mean, all kinds of data that is not known. But we know that preaching the gospel hasn't changed the American landscape either. So I would just say I'm really excited about this RFP as a first look into what's happening in the world. But it makes a huge difference that half your board are people of color, and that having 1 or 2 board members, the data shows, doesn't really change the dynamic. And our board members can talk about that. The data shows that once there's 3 people who are different, and the fact that they're not the champions of this issue, this issue is being championed by every one of my trustees, and they are excited about it. It's not an issue of some trustees. And then anyway, I wish I could show my website. Up on our website, because Greenlighting Institute helped call the attention that, just asking foundations their demographics, at least on those things that were reportable, just gender and race, I think it should be readily available. And on our website, you can see what our foundation looked like 10 years ago at staff and trustee levels. You can look at what we look like now. You can look at us at the executive level, at the exempt level, all across the program staff. And you can look by gender and race. and you can judge for yourself. There's no commentary in there about whether this is good or bad. You'll see we're less white and less female than we were 10 years ago. We're still 75% both. And you'll see how we break out in classes of people, in categories. But it's just to be transparent. We think that's the least we can do, is show people who we are. And when I went to the website today, I naively went to the Who We Are pull down, and it wasn't there. You know, it was in the newsroom in Foundation Facts, and you had to go dig for it. And no one has called me up and say, hey, it's a PowerPoint, you can print it out, you can look at it. And I'd love your comments on it too. But I think you have to start changing yourself, obviously. But there again, we've seen, you know, diversity without inclusion and without changing the context. I know my staff members of color would still have lots to say about what it's like to work at the foundation. And we you know, across our vendors, our grants, our grantees, the capacity of our grantees, our board and our staff, it is a journey. And the Diversity and Philanthropy Project, in which I'm serving as vice co-chair with Stephen Heinz and Bob Ross of the California Endowment leads that, is an exciting project in philanthropy that is not an initiative of any private foundation, but is embedded in a very decentralized matrix of infrastructure groups and foundations to be a resource to philanthropy for any foundation that wants to advance wherever it is in its journey, wherever it can go to take the next step. There are no grades in this work. It is just a question of helping move the field. So that's an exciting project. Thanks for that question. Sorry, I can't get there.
Well, briefly, when you were talking before about there being no easy way of looking up the wisdom that's been accumulated in philanthropic foundations, we, as a matter of fact, just this week soft launched a website that includes a case study database that at the moment has about 400 case studies in it, of which 350 or so have been pretty thoroughly abstracted and categorized and keyworded and so forth. And that will continue to grow over the next 6 months, a year, whatever. I anticipate that in the next year or two we'll have hundreds of thousands. So, in fact, in not too long a time, you will be able to go to our website, type in something like teenage pregnancy, and you can find what has been written by foundations. If anything has been, obviously there are going to be, this will be a tool among other things that will indicate where the literature exists and where it really doesn't exist. That's will be an interesting thing in itself.
And absolutely, and I know the case studies that you pulled together. Is this part of this project? I mean, it's a fabulous resource, and again, who's your audience or your customer is going to be one question. 2 points. I mean, one praise and one criticism. Joel brought up Peter Frumkin's, the expressive and instrumental philanthropy. It's still the right of every individual donor to be expressive and to want to be inventive. I met a wonderful donor who had seen Intel's computer clubhouse model and saw how powerful it was, how it worked, and she had just put in money to build more Intel clubhouses elsewhere. But she said, I know that's really effective and everything, but I want to invent something myself, because that's what we did in our business, and that was expressive philanthropy. I don't want to just replicate or take something else to scale that's absolutely, I want to invent something. So, people, that's their right to be expressive. Individual donors are not a rational economic marketplace. But foundations don't have that excuse, right? We should be strategic. We should be using your case studies, and I just want to hold up the Buffett Early Childhood Fund. When Susie Buffett knew that she was going to receive from her father probably $1 billion to start her foundation, she asked an old friend, Dan Peterson, a journalist at Newsweek who was about to retire, and I know this because I met Dan about a year ago. She asked Dan to help her think about how she could use this money to have the most effect on education in the 21st century. So they set out to look at the field. And they came pretty quickly to early childhood, I think. I can't tell it. I don't know what order this happened. And then they looked at the field of early childhood, and they discovered Irving Harris's work for 2 decades at the Ounce of Prevention Project in Chicago. So here was a brand new philanthropist who, when I met Dan, they had lifted up the Ounce of Prevention's work in Educare, And Educare, Harriet, Maya, and others will say, we had fabulous failures in our first 20. We knew early child was the answer, but every time we went to execute, we failed miserably. We just couldn't make it work. Thank God they didn't give up. Or thank God Buffett didn't say, well, that's their failure, let's start something new. They looked at their lessons learned, they lifted it up, and they started bringing other philanthropists into this mix. And when I met them, having had this new commitment to 0 to 8, and I saw what they had done to organize state advocates, to organize national viewpoints, and to build new Educare centers around the country, mostly funded by individual donors. And the Secretary of Education was out at the dedication of a second one in Oklahoma last week. I said, my gosh, this is a network made in heaven. And I said I'd be honored on behalf of Mr. Kellogg, the only non-living donor in this group, to join the 5 families at the time. And when I said, please send us a proposal, we would love to fund all 3 aspects of this. And when the request came in, one of my staffers said, boy, they're asking for a lot of money. This is as much money as anybody else is putting into this fund. And we're not the driver. I said, no, but we're committed to 0 to 8. And we can't all build our rockets, individual rockets, to get to the moon. They're building this rocket. We can give them fuel for the second stage. We can be a limited partner and just put money into this incredible partnership, which had been organized by another great leader. And so there was an example where they had looked at best practices, organized lots of other donors who also could have gone off and done their own thing. And so at our meeting on Capitol Hill last week, there were several billionaires in the room, business people that had funded this work and were there to lobby. Not me, I wasn't there to lobby. They were there to talk to elected officials about early childhood when Professor Heckman gave a little keynote. They were the advocates for this because they had been educated in this group, and it was a tremendous example of taking best practices and organizing to go to a whole nother level. And I was just thrilled to say, as I said, the extra gravity of poverty and race that keeps our kids from reaching escape velocity is very powerful. So if someone has got a rocket pretty well built, we are crazy not to say, how do I support that? So they didn't have the benefit of your case studies, and thank God it was sort of the word of mouth of peers. But again, anytime either so as a driver, the challenge is bringing other people to your partnership who don't want to do their own thing. And this was an example of very smart, successful people joining together to make a change. So,
well, on that note, I want to, on behalf of all of us, thank Sterling for a fabulous conversation.